Okay, there's an optional workbook here, and I'm going to show you that. There are dozens of examples. They cover each of the 13 categories and the 30 techniques. Now, you don't have to have it, but it's we priced it really low so that you can get into it. It's much lower, for example, than some of the other workbooks or the other orchestration books. So let's look at an example. All right, this example has two dozen or more scoring solutions to it, believe it or not. Now, we've had 6 composers, and I'll show you this slide in a minute, go through and mock this and do scores. They didn't record it, but they did scores on how they would have orchestrated this particular piece of music here. Let's just go through some of the issues that are involved. This is Bourrée Fantasque by Emmanuel Chabrier. First thing you got to notice is that these are repeated notes, so they come from the technique, how do you score repeated notes? Well, when we get to repeated notes, we're dealing with things like round robin, or what another company calls repetition mode. What we're trying to avoid here, or what some composers refer to as the machine gun sound, because it sounds so mathematically precise, it's non-musical. So this first group of bars here, under the red arrows, and then down on the second stave, really create fits for most string libraries, and that's why I picked it. This is a great way to try out your library and see what it will or won't do. And if you're a sample developer, listening to this is a great way to test it before we do, so you know what your scripting should be doing. Now, let's just look at the tempo. This tempo is 152. Again, very brisk tempo. It's marked marcatissimo. If you look at the little hash marks underneath the pitches on the first couple lines, that's going, when that translates to orchestra, that's going to be a spiccato bowing where the bow is bouncing off the string. And at that tempo, you've really got to have professional players to make it happen. And if you don't have a spiccato that really works that well, then you've got to go for another type of articulation. It may be marked détaché. Sometimes they're marked short. Sometimes they're marked with a time like a 0.07 or 0.5, 0.05. Different companies mark them different way. So you need to go in there again and look at your library and see, well, how are they marking the length of these pitches? How are they labeled? Now, I said there are 2 dozen or more scoring solutions. That's not a joke. Just in the first few bars where I have it underlined with repeated notes and string unisons, I came up with 11 different combinations that were possible there. And that's because when you look at the range of the pitches here, you find out that 4 of the 5 string sections can play in unison on that line. But by the time you get down to the lines on the second stave, and it gets down to the F, you're now off the violins. Violins cannot play below a G. And so once you get down to there, you've got the whole violin section dropping out. So you have to look to see how you want to balance that out. One solution that works across the boards is doubling that passage with violas and cellos in unison, and then going from there. But again, we've got a number of different solutions, and I've mapped those out for you in a separate brochure you can take a look at your leisure. The red arrow on the second stave pointing up, or that would be called a run in sample language. And then below that, you'll see a descending chromatic line underneath the 16th notes. So you have all that to consider, plus, do you have first and second violins? Or do you have just one violin section? Well, if you just have one violin section sound, and you try to put these together to create a unison, all they do is sound like a thickened string line, or actually a thickened synth line is what I should say. And so a way around that is by changing the panning structure. So instead of using the typical U.S. orchestra seating pattern, which is violins one, violins two, violas and cellos, and basses in the back angled off to the right, use what's called the European sitting pattern, and you have violins, first violins, violas, cellos, and then violins two on the far right, with the basses angled behind them, angling and aiming back behind the cellos. Now the advantage of that is when you're scoring, is when you're doing your mix. You have the violin one and two part in unison here coming out of the left and right speakers. It doesn't completely give you the feeling of a whole big string section or this big swing string sweep, but it can help you to create a little bit more of a realistic sound, so that it does sound like it's not a big synth, but it really is a string section. And so that's happening within the mixing and recording process. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Well, if you go to the TrueSpec website, you see this 50th anniversary Professional Orchestration, a Practical Handbook. We've asked the question, how would you score this passage for strings? And 6 fellows, including myself, and you can find me, I'm easily the best looking one on the page. Joke. You can go down there and see that 6 of us scored it, and all 6 came up with different solutions. So all the solutions are on PDFs. You should download it, score it for yourself, see what you come up with, and then download it. But it'll give you an idea of the approach to take. And the first one is you do the compositional solution first, and then go back and do the MIDI mockup solution, and you go through the issues and the questions I put before you. Well, let me just explain how this works for purchasing. There is from piano to strings. You can buy it as a book only, or we have a MIDI file package with it that are the files for all the majority of the examples in the book exported from Sibelius, and those are available as a book and MIDI file package. You can get it printed or you can get it PDF. If you're in Europe, you may want to, and you don't want to pay the shipping, which I certainly understand, then by all means get the PDF version. And I'll come back to that in a second. The workbook, same principle. There's a workbook, or there's a workbook and audio files. Now, the audio files are, we have recorded the piano parts in both the practical handbook and the workbook. And so, because those piano parts are used throughout all the books, rather than trying to come up with some complicated package where you're getting the same piano parts 3 times, we're just putting all the piano parts with the workbook. So you get the MIDI files with the main book, and you get the piano files with the workbook. And you can get that as a workbook by itself without the audio. You can get it with the audio, and you can get it printed or PDF. This is where you can get those books from. We have all kinds of bundle packages for you. All right, I want to thank you for staying with me. I hope you learned something from this. I'm Peter Alexander. Be blessed.